Hello guys. Tonight, we will leave the modern world behind and travel together to the shadowy valleys and towering castles of feudal Japan, the era of samurai and mysterious shinobi. It was a time of honor and betrayal, of grand battles under banners and secret wars fought in silence by those who acted unseen. Before we enter this world of swords and shadows, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if you really enjoy these journeys we take together. And tell us in the comments where you are from and what time of day it is for you. It's always interesting to see how this community spans the globe. Now dim the lights, immerse yourself in the silence of the night, and get ready to join me on a journey to an era when a single whisper in the dark could change the fate of entire nations. Tonight, we're heading to Japan, the realm of samurai and ninja, the Sengoku Battlegrounds, a century of fire and blood before the calm bureaucratic order of the Tokugawa shogunate settled over Japan. The archipelago endured more than a century of unrelenting chaos and bloodshed. This was the Sengoku period, 1467 to 1603, an era whose name literally translates to the Age of Warring States. The collapse of the central authority of the Ashikaga shogunate created a power vacuum, plunging the nation into a bitter civil war. Ambitious daimyo, powerful regional warlords, rose from the ashes of the old order, carving out domains through force of will and endless warfare. They battled relentlessly for territory, wealth, and the ultimate prize, unifying Japan under their own banner. At the very heart of this violent storm were the samurai. Unlike the paper-pushing samurai of the later Edo period, their Sengoku predecessors lived with death as a constant, daily companion. Their world was not one of ink and ledgers, but of mud, steel, and blood. A samurai's primary function was brutally simple: to kill for his lord and to be prepared to die. Battles were not small-scale skirmishes. They were massive, province-spanning campaigns that could involve tens of thousands of men. Great castles, marvels of defensive architecture, were besieged for months, and entire provinces could change hands in a matter of weeks. The samurai of this era were expected to be ruthless. There was little room for mercy when prisoners could be summarily executed, and peasants, known as ashigaru, light feet, were often forcibly conscripted to swell the ranks of armies as foot soldiers. Beyond the samurai's grand battles, a secret war was fought by shinobi, specialists in espionage, sabotage, and assassination from the Iga and Koga clans. Hired by ambitious warlords, these shadow warriors served as spies and assassins whose skills could shift the balance of power. Their ability to infiltrate fortresses or eliminate enemy leaders often proved more effective than thousands of soldiers, making them a vital and feared force in Japanese warfare. Unlike the samurai, whose honor bound them to codes of open combat, the shinobi embraced stealth, deception, and unconventional tactics. They gathered intelligence, spread misinformation, set fires to enemy strongholds, and carried out precise strikes that could cripple a rival clan from within. During the turbulent Sengoku period, their covert operations became indispensable to daimyo seeking advantage in an era of constant strife, ensuring the shinobi's place as both feared and respected figures in Japan's military history. One of the defining clashes of this brutal age, a battle that forever altered the course of Japanese warfare, was the Battle of Nagashino in 1575. The conflict pitted the brilliant and innovative warlord Oda Nobunaga and his ally Tokugawa Ieyasu against the formidable forces of Takeda Katsuyori. The Takeda clan was legendary, famed across Japan for its powerful cavalry, considered by many to be the most ferocious and effective mounted force in the land. Katsuyori, confident in his elite warriors, laid siege to Nagashino Castle, a key Tokugawa stronghold. Nobunaga, however, was a master of new technologies and unconventional tactics. Marching to relieve the castle with a combined force of 38,000 men, he chose not to meet the famed Takeda cavalry in a traditional open-field clash. Instead, he did something revolutionary. Across the plain, facing the Takeda army, he ordered his troops to construct long wooden barricades and earthen ramparts. Behind these defenses, he positioned some 3,000 ashigaru, armed with arquebuses, imported matchlock guns that were still a relatively new and often underestimated weapon. As the battle commenced, Takeda Katsuyori, against the advice of his veteran commanders, ordered his cavalry to charge. Wave after wave of mounted samurai, the pride of the Takeda clan, galloped across the muddy ground, expecting to shatter the Oda Tokugawa lines as they had done so many times before. But as they were funneled towards the barricades, Nobunaga unleashed his devastating surprise. He had arranged his gunners in ranks, ordering them to fire in coordinated volleys. As one rank fired, another would reload, ensuring a near continuous hail of lead. The result was a slaughter. The thunderous roar of the matchlocks tore through the charging cavalry, shattering their momentum and their morale. Horses and riders fell in tangled, screaming heaps. For 8 hours, the Takeda threw themselves against the defenses, but the gunfire was relentless, and any warrior who managed to reach the palisades was met by spearmen. The Battle of Nagashino was a decisive victory for Oda Nobunaga and a clear signal that a new era of warfare had begun, where technology and tactics could triumph over traditional martial prowess. These ceaseless wars forged legends and heroes, but they also laid bare the brutal reality of samurai life. The code of honor, later known as Bushido, was praised in tales and poems, but on the blood-soaked battlefields, victory was all that mattered. Treachery was a common tool of statecraft. Alliances were fluid, shifting with the winds of fortune. It was not uncommon for vassals to betray their lords, for brothers to kill brothers, or for sons to rise against their fathers to seize power. For the samurai of the Sengoku era, life was a precarious balance of duty and ambition. Survival demanded constant vigilance and a willingness to embrace the savage pragmatism of the age. The glory of a cavalry charge or a heroic duel was often overshadowed by the grim realities of hunger, disease, exhaustion, and the muddy, anonymous death of an endless campaign. This crucible of conflict would ultimately forge the three great unifiers, Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and Tokugawa Ieyasu, who would bring the century of war to a close and usher in an unprecedented era of peace. The Shadow War, Shinobi in the Age of Warring States. If the Sengoku period was the grand, blood-soaked theater of the battlefield samurai, it was also the golden age of a different kind of warrior, one who operated behind the curtain, the ninja or shinobi. Far from the later myths of invisibility, demonic powers, and outright sorcery, the historical ninja were masters of a deadly and pragmatic craft. They were specialists in espionage, sabotage, guerrilla warfare, and assassination. During this era of constant conflict, powerful warlords, recognizing the limits of conventional warfare, frequently contracted the formidable ninja clans of Iga and Koga provinces to serve as their eyes, ears, and hidden daggers. These clans were not merely random collections of spies. They were unique warrior societies forged by their environment. The provinces of Iga and Koga were remote, mountainous, and difficult to access, which allowed them to maintain a fierce independence from the great daimyo who surrounded them. In this crucible of autonomy, they developed a military doctrine, later known as ninjutsu, that prioritized intelligence, deception, and survival over the samurai's emphasis on open combat and honor. They trained from childhood in stealth, disguise, infiltration, explosives, poisons, and a wide array of specialized weapons. They were, in essence, highly trained specialists in irregular warfare, and their skills were in high demand. One of the most famous and brutal chapters in their history came during the unification campaigns of the fearsome warlord Oda Nobunaga. By the late 1570s, Nobunaga had conquered much of central Japan. But the stubborn independence of Iga province, a land he saw as a nest of dissent, was a thorn in his side. In 1579, his ambitious but less capable son, Oda Nobukatsu, decided to make a name for himself by subjugating the province. He launched a massive invasion with over 10,000 soldiers, expecting a swift victory against what he perceived as a collection of rural holdouts. The result was a profound humiliation. The Iga warriors, intimately familiar with their homeland's terrain, refused to meet Nobunaga's army in open battle. They used their mountainous landscape to their supreme advantage, turning the entire province into a deadly trap. Night raids crippled Nobukatsu's logistics. Lone operatives set fire to his camps, and false intelligence sent his patrols on fruitless chases into ambushes. The Iga shinobi would strike from the dense shadows of the forests and then vanish, leaving confusion and terror in their wake. After his army was routed in a series of brilliant guerrilla actions, a disgraced Nobukatsu was forced into a full retreat. The small province of Iga had, for a time, defeated the most powerful clan in Japan. This victory, however, sealed their doom. In 1581, an enraged Oda Nobunaga returned to finish the job himself, this time unleashing an overwhelming force of some 40,000 to 60,000 men to invade from multiple directions. What followed was not a battle, but a campaign of annihilation. Nobunaga's scorched earth tactics were merciless. Villages were burned to the ground, and the independent warrior families of Iga were systematically hunted down and slaughtered. The province was crushed under a wave of iron and fire. The survivors were forced to scatter across Japan, their homeland lost. Many of these refugee ninja, their families and fortunes destroyed, had no choice but to sell their unique skills to the highest bidder, often entering the service of Nobunaga's rivals. One such rival was the patient and cunning Tokugawa Ieyasu. In 1582, this connection would prove to be world-changing. After Nobunaga was betrayed and assassinated by his general Akechi Mitsuhide at Honnoji Temple in Kyoto, Japan was thrown into chaos. Ieyasu was in a perilous position, deep in enemy territory, with only a small retinue. It was a moment of supreme vulnerability, where he could have easily been captured or killed. It was then that his ninja allies, led by the legendary Hattori Hanzo, himself a samurai from Iga, stepped out of the shadows. They guided Ieyasu and his men on a harrowing trek through hostile territory, using secret paths and their network of contacts to avoid Akechi's patrols. This dangerous escape ensured Ieyasu's survival, allowing him to return to his own stronghold, consolidate his power, and eventually rise to become the final unifier of Japan and its first Tokugawa shogun. These episodes reveal the true nature of the Sengoku-era ninja. They were not sorcerers, but pragmatic survivors and masters of asymmetrical warfare. They thrived in the gaps between massive armies, understanding that a well-placed spy could be more valuable than 1,000 spearmen, and that a single act of sabotage could turn the tide of a campaign. In the shadows of the great samurai wars, their quiet victories and silent operations often determined the fates of the most powerful clans, and in the case of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the very future of Japan itself. The paper samurai. Why it was bad to be low-ranking. Forget the lone wolf duelist on a windswept plain. Forget the general commanding thousands from his warhorse. For the vast majority of samurai, the reality was this. This is the life of a gokenin, a low-ranking, low-stipend retainer of a feudal lord. And for centuries, it was a life of quiet desperation. After the Tokugawa shogunate unified Japan in 1600, the Great Wars ended. An era of unprecedented peace, known as the Edo period, settled over the islands. And for the warrior class, peace was a professional catastrophe. With no battles to fight, their purpose had to be reinvented. For a low-ranking samurai, this meant becoming a bureaucrat. His katana, the soul of the samurai, was now used primarily to slice through piles of paperwork. His daily duty was not defending his lord's castle, but managing his lord's rice tax accounts, surveying land, drafting permits for travel, and settling petty disputes between farmers. He was a clerk with a topknot and 2 swords, drowning in a sea of ink and protocol. And the pay was terrible. A samurai's income was measured in koku of rice, 1 koku being enough to feed 1 man for a year. A high-ranking lord might have millions. A mid-level samurai, a few hundred. But a low-ranking retainer, he might receive a paltry 20, 30, or 40 koku. After supporting his family, his own attendants, and maintaining his equipment and presentable clothing, there was often nothing left. Historical diaries from the period are filled with lamentations of debt, of pawning heirlooms, and of the sheer humiliation of having to negotiate with wealthy but low-status merchants from the merchant class just to make ends meet. But the greatest burden was not poverty or paperwork. It was the constant, crushing, ever-present fear of disgrace. The samurai code, Bushido, demanded absolute loyalty and impeccable conduct. A simple mistake in accounting, a poorly worded letter, a minor breach of etiquette in the presence of a superior, Any of these could be construed as a failure of duty. The punishment was not a fine or a demotion. It was often kondo, dismissal from service. To be Ronin, a masterless samurai, was a social and economic death sentence, a fate often worse than literal death. His entire existence was a tightrope walk over an abyss of shame, performed not on a battlefield, but in a dusty office. This was the hidden truth for most samurai, a life defined not by glorious combat, but by the fear of making a single error on a spreadsheet. The revenge of the 47 Ronin, a calculated death sentence. This is the most famous story in Japanese history, a national legend of loyalty and revenge. But the true story of the 47 Ronin is not a simple tale of heroes and villains. It is a dark, complex drama about the terrifying conflict between human emotion and the rigid, unforgiving law of the samurai. In 1701, a high-ranking court official named Lord Kira Yoshinaka was assigned to tutor Lord Asano Naganori in the intricate ceremonies of the Tokugawa court. Kira, arrogant and corrupt, expected lavish gifts for his tutelage. The young and principled Asano refused to bribe him. After months of petty insults and public humiliations, Asano's patience snapped. Within the sacred precincts of Edo Castle, he drew his short sword and attacked Kira, wounding him slightly. The crime of drawing a blade inside the shogun's castle was immense. The punishment for Asano was swift and severe. Ordered to commit ritual suicide, seppuku. His lands were confiscated, his family line abolished, and his samurai were disbanded, cast adrift as masterless Ronin. Their leader, Oishi Kuranosuke, faced an impossible choice. The samurai code demanded vengeance for their lord, but the shogun's law explicitly forbade it. To obey the code was to break the law and be executed. To obey the law was to live in perpetual dishonor. Oishi chose the code, but what followed was not a swift charge into battle. It was a masterclass in deception and patience that lasted nearly 2 years. The 47 men dispersed. Oishi himself became a notorious drunkard, frequenting brothels and taverns, publicly shaming himself so that Kira's spies would believe he had given up. All the while, in secret, they were planning. They smuggled weapons, mapped Kira's heavily fortified mansion, and waited for the perfect moment. On a freezing night in December 1702, they struck. In a perfectly coordinated military assault, they breached Kira's compound, subdued his guards without unnecessary bloodshed, and found the cowardly Kira hiding in an outhouse. They offered him the same honor their lord was given, the chance to die by his own hand. When he refused, they beheaded him with the very dagger Asano had used for his seppuku. They had succeeded. They had fulfilled their duty. And now, they had to face the consequence. The nation was captivated. They were heroes. But the shogun, Tokugawa Tsunayoshi, was trapped by the same law they had broken. He could not pardon them. After weeks of deliberation, he ordered them to commit seppuku, not as criminals, but as honored samurai. Their graves at Sengoku Temple in Tokyo are visited to this day. Their story is the ultimate paradox of the samurai, an act of supreme loyalty that could only be completed by accepting state-sanctioned death. Shinobi no Mono, the myth of the superhuman ninja. The ninja, or shinobi, is one of history's most misunderstood figures. Pop culture gives us a superhuman assassin clad head to toe in black, performing impossible acrobatics and wielding exotic weaponry. The reality was far more subtle and far more clever. The truth about ninjas is that their greatest weapon wasn't a shuriken or a sword. It was information. They were spies, saboteurs, and scouts in the fractured, war-torn Japan of the 15th and 16th centuries. Their manuals, like the famed Bansen Shukai and Shoninki, survive today, and they read less like mystic martial arts texts and more like gritty field guides to espionage. The core shinobi strategy was disguise. To be invisible meant to blend in perfectly. A skilled shinobi would travel behind enemy lines, not in a black jumpsuit, but as a komuso, a wandering monk with a large basket hat that hid his face. He might be a sarugaku performer, using a traveling acting troupe as cover to enter a castle town. He could be a merchant, a farmer, or even a servant. The goal was to listen, to observe garrison sizes, gate layouts, and the morale of the troops, and to report back. Their scrolls are filled with breathtakingly practical and often brutal advice. How to start fires using gunpowder and dried fish scales as a slow fuse. How to use common tools like sickles and spades as weapons. How to scale walls with ropes and grappling hooks. Which poisons could be extracted from local plants. And crucially, how to detect lies and spread misinformation. Sowing discord and paranoia within an enemy castle was often more effective than attacking it. The famous ninja clans, like the Iga and Koka, were not secret societies, but communities of families in specific mountainous regions who developed these skills as a form of guerrilla warfare to protect their independence against much larger samurai armies. They sold their services to warlords who needed deniable assets. The myth of the superhuman ninja was in fact a form of psychological warfare. By allowing exaggerated stories of their dark powers to spread, they made their enemies afraid of shadows, inflating their own reputation and effectiveness without ever having to throw a single star. The Cage of Gold, inside the Tokugawa court. After securing ultimate power, the Tokugawa shoguns faced a new enemy: ambition. How do you prevent your most powerful rivals from overthrowing you? The answer was not built with stone walls and moats alone. It was built with ritual, psychology, and exquisite, soul-crushing boredom. Welcome to the Tokugawa court. The shoguns created a system of alternate attendance, or senkin kotai. This law forced every regional lord, or daimyo, to spend every other year in attendance at the shogun's court in Edo, Tokyo. And when they returned to their home domains, they were required to leave their wives and heirs behind in Edo as permanent, glorified hostages. This system achieved two things. It bled the daimyo financially, forcing them to spend fortunes on maintaining lavish estates in Edo and on the processional journeys back and forth, leaving no money for raising armies. And secondly, it brought the shogun's potential enemies right under his watchful eye. Life at court was a meticulously staged political theater. It was a world of stiflingly structured calm, where every minute of the day was governed by protocol. Where you sat, how you bowed, the tone of your voice, the quality of your robes, everything was a signal of your status, and everything was monitored. To pass the endless days of enforced attendance, the captive aristocracy engaged in highly refined and intensely competitive pastimes. They became patrons of art, theater, and poetry. But the most revealing game was the Kodo, the Way of Incense. In the incense ceremony, participants would listen to a piece of classical literature being read, and then smell different, subtly varied incenses burned one by one. Their task was to identify which incense matched which fragment of the tale. It required immense wealth, a hypersensitive nose, and a poetic soul. It was the ultimate symbol of the Tokugawa peace, the fiercest warriors in Japanese history, now competing not on the strength of their arm, but on the sensitivity of their nostrils. The court was a gilded cage. The shogun had successfully tamed his rivals, transforming them from warlords into courtiers, their aggression sublimated into art and aroma. The silence of the court wasn't peaceful. It was the sound of an entire class of warriors holding its breath. This was the hidden engine of the 250-year peace, a masterpiece of political manipulation where the greatest threat was not the sword, but a slight misstep in etiquette, or the faint, haunting smell of a lost game. Women of the shadows, Kunoichi wives, and the hidden power behind the sword. When we imagine samurai Japan, the image is almost always masculine, armored men charging across the battlefield, or stern-faced lords in lacquered armor dictating the fate of provinces. But beneath this world of steel and banners was another, quieter layer of power. Women whose influence shaped wars, preserved clans, and altered the political balance of the entire country. They were Kunoichi spies who slipped into enemy strongholds, noble wives who lived as hostages in Edo, and mothers who taught future warlords the arts of survival. Their power was not in swords, but in shadows, silence, and sacrifice. The Kunoichi, women as shinobi, the ninja of Iga and Koka, are legendary, but the role of women within those mountain communities is less well known. The term kunoichi appears in later writings and is often taken to mean female ninja, though in the Sengoku period, their role was practical and rooted in espionage. Unlike the popular image of black-clad assassins leaping across rooftops, female operatives specialized in infiltration. A woman could pass unnoticed where a man might raise suspicion. She could pose as a servant, seamstress, entertainer, or courtesan, and slip into the women's quarters of a castle, where valuable gossip about garrison sizes, food stores, and a lord's mood might be exchanged. The Bansen Shukai, the great 17th century ninja manual compiled by Fujibayashi Yasutake, explicitly mentions using women for intelligence work. It notes that women could penetrate households with ease, gathering secrets or planting disinformation. They could also carry weapons disguised as household tools, a hairpin sharpened into a dagger, or a small packet of poison sewn into clothing. One story, though shrouded in legend, tells of Kunoichi being used to lure samurai officers into compromising positions, where their trust could be exploited or their lives ended quietly. But the reality was subtler. A Kunoichi's greatest asset was not seduction or assassination. It was her ability to blend seamlessly into enemy territory, observe, and return with knowledge that could turn the tide of a campaign. Wives as hostages. The Tokugawa Gilded Cage. By the 17th century, open battlefields were replaced by court politics. The Tokugawa shoguns, wary of rebellion, instituted the system of Sankin Kotai, alternate attendance. Every daimyo was forced to spend alternate years in Edo, modern Tokyo, and crucially, they were required to leave their wives and heirs behind in Edo when they returned to their domains. These women lived in Edo not by choice, but as political hostages. Their lives were wrapped in silk, luxury, and rigid etiquette, yet beneath the gilded surface was captivity. They were separated from their husbands for long stretches under the constant surveillance of Tokugawa officials. Even their letters home were carefully monitored. The shogunate understood that daimyo would never risk rebellion while their wives and children were effectively prisoners in Edo. In this way, the women of samurai Japan became the keystones of Tokugawa control, their enforced presence a silent guarantee of loyalty. But within these confines, they wielded influence. A daimyo's wife often became a cultural leader within Edo, presiding over salons of poetry, art, and incense ceremonies. Through patronage and social networks, they could shape alliances and reputations. Though their swords were taken from them, their words and presence carried enormous weight. Mothers who made warlords. Behind every famous samurai leader stood a mother whose decisions and teachings molded his path. In a society where men were often raised by wet nurses and retainers, it was the political marriages of mothers that forged alliances and determined succession. Take the case of Oda Nobunaga, the first great unifier of Japan. His mother, Doda Gozen, was married into the Oda clan as part of a political alliance. While Nobunaga's eccentricities earned him the nickname the Fool of Owari, it was his mother's position that helped shield him in youth until he grew powerful enough to dominate his rivals. Similarly, Tokugawa Ieyasu's mother, Odai no Kata, played a decisive role in his survival. When Ieyasu was a child hostage caught between rival clans, Odai was forced to separate from him, her own position used as a bargaining chip. Her endurance and sacrifice ensured Ieyasu's safety, and that he lived to become the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate. Later, Odai became revered as the matriarch of the Tokugawa line, a living reminder that the dynasty owed its survival not only to men's battles, but also to women's suffering. Even more dramatic is the story of Lady Yodo, Yodo Dono, the mistress of Toyotomi Hideyoshi and mother of his heir, Hideyori. After Hideyoshi's death, she became the guardian of the Toyotomi legacy and effectively the ruler of Osaka Castle. When Tokugawa forces besieged the castle in 1614 to 1615, Lady Yodo resisted fiercely, rallying defenders and negotiating directly with generals. Her failure led to the annihilation of the Toyotomi line, but her determination showed how women could step directly into the arena of war when fate demanded it. The invisible hand of influence. Women in samurai Japan rarely fought on open battlefields, but their influence ran deep in the cracks of power. As Kunoichi, they spied, sabotaged, and spread misinformation. As wives in Edo, they were hostages who guaranteed political stability while still shaping culture and status. As mothers, they raised heirs, forged alliances, and sometimes ruled as regents or guardians when their sons were too young. Even ordinary women in samurai households played roles in transmitting values of loyalty, frugality, and endurance. the moral code that sustained the warrior class. The story of samurai Japan is not just one of swords and steel, but also of silken threads woven by women in the shadows. Without them, clans would have faltered, alliances would have collapsed, and dynasties would never have survived. Samurai Japan was a world where the loudest symbols of authority were male: banners, armor, swords, and castles. But much of the system rested on quiet, unseen labor by women. The Kunoichi, who listened behind shoji screens, the hostage wives who kept daimyo loyal through their captivity, and the mothers who shaped the heirs of warlords, all reveal a hidden truth. The fate of samurai Japan often rested in hands that never held a katana. The shadows were not empty. They were alive with power, endurance, and sacrifice. The silent enemy of the samurai: debts, duty, and the unbearable price of honor. The image of the samurai is one of strength, discipline, and loyalty. Men of iron will and sharpened steel, unmoved by fear or temptation. But behind this polished mask lay a quieter, crueler enemy. One that struck not on the battlefield, but in the tatami-lined chambers of clan mansions and within the ledgers of treasurers. This was the burden of debt, duty, and honor, the crushing weight of a social order that demanded perfection, pomp, and loyalty, even when it bankrupted entire families. The sword may have killed a samurai's body, but money and obligation often killed his spirit. From warriors to bureaucrats, during the Sengoku period, 15th to 16th centuries, samurai fought almost constantly. Wealth came from plunder, stipends from victorious lords, and the spoils of conquest. A samurai's honor was proved with his sword, but with the rise of Tokugawa Ieyasu and the establishment of the shogunate in 1603, the battlefield grew silent. The great wars ended. Samurai were no longer warriors, but administrators, clerks, and retainers in elaborate hierarchies. They still carried their two swords as symbols of their rank, but more often than not, they carried brushes, account books, and scrolls. And unlike merchants or farmers, who could generate wealth, the samurai relied entirely on fixed stipends paid in rice from their lords. These stipends did not increase, even as costs rose. Over time, many samurai found themselves living beyond their means, trapped between the ideals of honor and the arithmetic of survival. The burden of alternate attendance, sankin kotai, one of the greatest drains on samurai and daimyo households alike, was the sankin kotai system, introduced by the Tokugawa shoguns. Every daimyo was required to travel regularly between his home domain and Edo, bringing with him a vast retinue of samurai retainers. These journeys were public theater on an enormous scale. Daimyo traveled with hundreds, sometimes thousands of attendants in elaborate processions. Banners flying, armor gleaming, palanquins carrying wives and children, musicians playing, servants hauling lacquerware, clothing, and gifts. The expense was ruinous. Daimyo poured fortunes into roads, lodging, and supplies, while their retainers had to purchase new clothing, maintain their armor, and perform rituals with perfect precision. Even when daimyo returned to their domains, their wives and heirs remained in Edo as hostages, forcing families to maintain two luxurious households at once. The cost of loyalty was crushing. Many domains fell into debt, borrowing heavily from wealthy merchant families in Osaka, Kyoto, or Edo. And these debts trickled down the hierarchy to the samurai retainers whose stipends now seemed woefully insufficient. The etiquette trap. Life in Edo was not defined by swordsmanship, but by protocol. Samurai were judged by how they bowed, how they dressed, how they spoke. Clothing had to match one's rank. Armor and swords had to be maintained to dazzling standards. The smallest slip, an overly casual gesture, the wrong color of robe, the wrong level of politeness could bring shame, ruin, or even dismissal. To keep up appearances, samurai spent far beyond their means. Lavish robes of silk, fine calligraphy tools, tea sets, incense, and gifts were not luxuries, but necessities in a system where reputation determined survival. This etiquette was a form of psychological warfare waged by the Tokugawa system against its own warrior class. Samurai who had once proved themselves on battlefields like Sekigahara now proved themselves by sitting for hours in audience chambers without moving, or by competing in poetry contests and incense ceremonies. For many, this transformation from fighters to ornamental bureaucrats was suffocating. The rise of debt. By the 18th century, the problem was everywhere. Daimyo were drowning in loans to merchant houses. Samurai stipends, fixed in rice, could not keep pace with the growing expenses of life in Edo. A middle-ranking samurai might be expected to dress in silks, keep multiple retainers or servants, and entertain guests, yet his stipend barely fed his family. The result was chronic debt. Samurai pawned their armor, borrowed against future stipends, or took humiliating loans from the very merchants they were supposed to disdain. Ironically, the merchant class, at the bottom of the Confucian hierarchy, became the true financial masters of Japan, while the supposedly noble warrior class became their dependents. This contradiction ate away at the samurai identity, a class that prided itself on self-sufficiency and honor now lived at the mercy of moneylenders. The price of honor. Debt alone might have been survivable. What made it unbearable was the weight of honor. The samurai code, or Bushido, as it evolved in the Tokugawa era, emphasized loyalty, self-sacrifice, and the avoidance of shame at all costs. To fail financially, to be dismissed from service, or to show disgrace was intolerable. For some, the only escape was seppuku, ritual suicide. Countless samurai ended their lives, not in glorious battle, but because of financial collapse, failed duties, or minor breaches of etiquette. The sword they carried became not a weapon against enemies, but a final judgment against themselves. Even daimyo, crushed by impossible debts, sometimes chose ritual suicide rather than humiliation. Entire clans could be abolished if their lords failed to maintain order or solvency. In this way, the silent enemy, money, duty, honor, destroyed far more samurai than arrows or spears ever did. A class in decline. By the late Edo period, 18th to 19th centuries, the decline of the samurai was visible everywhere. Many had become Ronin, masterless samurai, not because of battle, but because their lords went bankrupt or were stripped of their domains. Others turned to secondary professions. Some taught martial arts. Some became bureaucrats for hire. A few even entered commerce themselves, though this was officially forbidden. The irony was stark. The samurai, supposedly the highest class, were impoverished, while merchants, supposedly the lowest, grew rich and powerful. It was this economic contradiction that contributed to the eventual collapse of the Tokugawa system and the Meiji Restoration of 1868. When Japan modernized, the samurai as a class were formally abolished. But in truth, they had already been hollowed out for centuries by the invisible weight of debt and duty. The unseen battlefield. The myth of the noble samurai, proud, fearless, and free, is only half the story. The other half is one of suffocation, trapped in a cage of etiquette, buried under debt, and crushed by a code of honor that allowed no escape from shame. Countless samurai perished in silence. Their greatest enemy was not the Mongol invasions, not rival clans, not even Western guns. It was a quieter enemy, a system that demanded they live beyond their means, bow endlessly to ritual, and hold their breath for 2.5 centuries of enforced peace. The battlefield of Sengoku, Japan, was won with swords, but the battlefield of Tokugawa, Japan, was fought in silence, with ledgers, rituals, and debts. And in that battle, many samurai lost.